Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fifth online meeting of the ICOM-SIGA Special Interest Group on Universal Accessibility, the Inclusive Museum. As you know, since last December, this season has been taking a step-by-step approach to explore the challenges of museums' accessibility, thanks to the participation of different and great specialists. So far, we have covered various topics, from evaluation and planning to strategy and policy. And today it's time to reflect on engaging the audience. Therefore, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Julie Bérubé, co-editor of the book Accessibility, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion in the Cultural Sector, published at Emerald Publishing last year. And the authors, Dr. Brea Heidelberg and Dr. Jesús Heredia Carroza, who contributed to this publication. Sorry, please turn up your microphones. So I'm going to introduce the three speakers of today. Dr. Julie Bérubé is a full professor in the Department of Administrative Sciences at the Université du Québec at Outaouais. Her research interests focus mainly on arts and culture management. She also studies issues of accessibility, diversity, equity, and inclusion, in particular, the role of cultural organizations and the attractiveness of audiences. Then Dr. Brea Heidelberg is an arts management educator, researcher, and consultant. She's associate professor of entertainment and arts management at Drexel University. Her research focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout the arts management ecosystem, human resources in cultural organizations, the professionalization of the field of arts management, and the training and development of arts administrators. And finally, Dr. Jesús Heredia Carroza researches and oversees the cultural, economic, and leisure and tourism sectors. He is professor at economics and economic history of Universidad de Sevilla and co-founder of the workshop on popular culture, economics and management, director of the social theory, politics and the arts conference, and vice president of the Fundación Pública de Estudios Universitario Francisco Maldonado de Osuna. So now, without further ado, dear colleagues, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Viviana, and thank you for the invitation. So I will just start by sharing my screen, if that's okay with you. Okay, so now you should see my PowerPoint. I guess that's it. It's okay? Yes? Good. So hello everyone, I'm really happy to be here with you today. So as Viviana already said, I'm a professor at the Université du Québec en Outaouais, which is a pretty small university in the province of Quebec in Canada. So I'm one of the three editors of the book Accessibility, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Cultural Sector, Initiatives and Lessons Learned from Real-Life Cases. The book was published with Emerald last year. So today I'm going to give a really brief overview of the book and then hand over to two authors on chapters on museum, so Brea Heidelberg and Jesús Heredia Carroza. So just to start, maybe I can just explain where did the idea for this book come from. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, but you will see where I'm going with that. So I studied the cultural sector for almost a decade, and I've taken an interest in several topics. So my first interest was in the identity tension experienced by artists who are torn between giving their creativity free rein and needing to earn a living. I also have an interest in cultural activity in rural areas, because the concentration of resources in major urban centers leaves artists in rural areas with limited resources, and unfortunately, it leads to a less robust cultural offering. So I'm sure that everyone here agree with me that cultures should remain accessible to all citizens, regardless of such factors as their origins, social status, gender, and location. So we all know that arts and culture bring well-being and have a positive economic and social impacts. So this book affirms the importance of promoting culture and its accessibility for all. It is essential that culture becomes a common good. So when I was young, I've always dreamed of a just society where differences are accepted and appreciated for their uniqueness. However, I quickly realized as I grew up that differences could frighten, making it easy for people to discriminate against others who did not belong to dominant groups. So this led me to take an interest in understanding issue of accessibility, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So now I will use the ADEI acronyms because it's shorter. So similar to many people, I have both privileged and unprivileged social identities. And I just want to say that I didn't want to assume that I understood other people's experiences with discrimination and marginalization, but I still dream of an inclusive and just society. So this is with a big load of humility that I began to study ADEI issues. My first research project on ADEI focused on the role that cultural organizations play in relation to ADEI issues in the cultural sector. So with this project, I had the chance to meet artists and cultural workers who are interested in ADEI issues and who are striving for a fair and inclusive sector. I quickly became interested in these initiatives because they were implementing really great things to promote inclusion. So cultural workers and artists around the world are advocating for ADEI and seeking greater social justice. So I think that it's important to recognize their work and their effort and to share this initiative to inspire others to join in making cultural sectors more fair and more inclusive. So this is this desire to acknowledge and highlight the work of others who give the book its purpose. So as the idea of the book took shape in my mind, it became clear to me that I couldn't work alone on such a project. So I turned to my colleague and friend Marie-Laure Dio from the Université du Québec en Outaouais, who has a strong research background on themes of equity, diversity, and inclusion, Quebec immigration, and socio-professional integration. At the same time, I've also approached Antonio C. Kyler because I have a great respect for all of his work on ADEI, particularly his relevant and timely contributions to the opera field. So I was very lucky because they both accepted my invitation to join me in this project. And I have to mention that their contributions were essential to the book's success. So now, what is it to expect from the book? So the book presents real-life examples of initiatives and projects promoting ADEI in the cultural sector. Given the book's practical roots, several chapters are written by a duo of authors who are both from the academic and practical backgrounds. This collaborative effort has enabled a fair representation of real-life cases while providing a theoretical contextualization of these initiatives. So we've decided to separate the book by artistic discipline. So we have 4 sections in the book: performing art, music, visual art, which are basically 3 chapters on museum, and events. At the beginning, one of our objectives was to identify trends or practices specific to each of these disciplines. But we quickly realized that the plurality of practices made it impossible to identify major trends for each discipline. Also, we didn't want the book to focus solely on one country, so we called on authors from all over the world. And we are really lucky because our approach paid off, as the book presents cases from a wide variety of countries, including, I name few, Canada, US, Colombia, Chad, Haiti, South Africa, Australia, and Taiwan. Now, about the audiences of the book. So by sharing initiatives that promote ADEI in the cultural sector, we aim to reach 2 target audiences: practitioners and academics. And for academics, it's both researchers and students. So practitioners may find interest in concrete initiatives that can be used to replicate or inspire other actions. Several best practices emerge from the cases presented, and initiatives from one artistic discipline can also inspire other cultural disciplines. So our goal is to break down barriers and foster exchange across all disciplines in the cultural sector. Similarly, initiatives in one country can inspire cultural workers in others to adopt certain practices or initiatives. As for academic, the real cases fuel reflection on challenges related to EDI in the cultural sector. Several cases present ideas that academics can further explore, especially in collaborative research projects. In this case, we can identify not only best practices, but also EDI challenges that the cultural sector faces. So academics could undertake research projects to find ways to overcome these challenges. The cases can also serve as teaching material, providing concrete examples that illustrate the theories taught in art and cultural management classrooms. University programs that focus on art and culture management are increasing in numbers. These programs much teach concepts of ADI, and this book is a really good tool to promote the practical application of theories. So real cases from various disciplines and regions help students to understand the breadth of possibility for promoting and integrating ADI in the cultural sector. So this was a really brief presentation of the book. Now I will leave the floor to my colleagues so that they can present their own chapter. So we can start with Brea Heidelberg, and then we will go with Jesús Heredia Carroza. So I will stop my sharing to let Brea share our own screen.
Hello, everyone. Just going to jump right into my presentation. All right. So the title of my chapter was Beyond Fakequity, Redefining Excellence to Create Space for Equity. I'll start off with a personal introduction just to place myself in where this study comes from and how my personal life and influences and identities are grounded in this particular work. And then I'll jump right into the case itself with an overview of the context, the methodology, and the findings, and then time for the discussion, which weaves in some of the theoretical pieces that were previously mentioned as far as marrying together the theory and the practice. So my name is Brea Heidelberg. I am a Black cisgendered woman. I'm also a mother to two small boys, mother of dragons, 8 and 3. So I am busy. My practicing background, I started out in the performing arts as a dancer and choreographer before transitioning into arts management. As my academic work, I'm associate professor of entertainment and arts management. My research overall, I try to be a practical theorist. The way that I've come to a lot of my work is that I personally experience something in the field or I witness something in the field and I wonder, I'm not that special. Clearly there's a theory or something to explain this. And if there isn't, or if it's something that sort of exists in another field, I figure out how it works in mine. Some relevant lines of research and inquiry that have informed this particular chapter is human resources management. So I have a book forthcoming through Routledge, which is Human Resources in the Arts. And so I was working on that at the same time. And so that a lot of that is infused into it. I also do work in organizational psychology. And the thing that was most pressing was research I was doing on the false dichotomy between compassion and compliance, or care and compliance, that happens in museums. And I worked on a publication and collaborative sort of interview project with museums moving forward on that. And then I've also done some work on the notion of fakequity and cultural policy. So all of those things are sort of in the theoretical soup that was swirling around as I was doing this work. Finally, and the reason why I was doing this project is I also have a consulting firm where I focus on human resources-based issues and organizational structuring, capacity, coaching, that sort of thing. And all of those elements were at play in this project. So the case study is a U.S. Arts museum that's embedded at a large university in the Midwest. And I find that to be important, especially since I'm going to be talking a lot about organizational culture. It's important to have that context. It's not just the museum's culture, but because it's an embedded institution, it also takes on some of the organizational cultural elements of the host. In this case, it would be a large university. The museum was awarded a grant from the IMLS to hire a consultant focused on diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. That was their way of articulating it, so DEAI. The original length of the engagement was March 2020 to November 2021. COVID pushed some of that back, and then we realized that there was a little more work that they wanted to do with me, and so it ended up being extended to June 2022. As I mentioned before, COVID was a factor, and so while the original conceptualization was that a lot more would be in person, the engagement was primarily via Zoom, and then there was an in-person component in November of the following year. The stated engagement goals, and these were from the both the grant application as well as the scoping sort of document that the organization came up with, but they were interested in working to create an adaptive and inclusive workplace and increase the understanding of how to go about doing that through more practical elements of hiring and retaining staff, particularly from marginalized and minoritized backgrounds, to help diversify the organization across staff, volunteer, and board members. They had an interesting quasi-board member structure where it's an advisory board that functions very similarly to a traditional 501c3 nonprofit board in the United States. However, it's still operating again within the larger university context. So there's a little bit less autonomy and power that that board has than they would in a normal nonprofit structure. They wanted to learn more about DEAI in order to be able to apply it to their specific job functions and roles throughout the museum. And they wanted to authentically engage people across a variety of different identity markers that they had done some work to research on their own about what were top of mind for them or what were the most important types of people that they wanted to make sure felt invite to feel more comfortable in the space than they had in the past. They were also interested in learning how to develop and maintain meaningful relationships across the university as well as in the community in order to increase the amplification of voices that had been silenced or ignored by the organization in the past. And so my research questions, and I put an asterisk there because I primarily came to this work as a consultant. And so while I am an academically based consultant and a lot of my stuff is theory based and theory grounded, I don't always initially approach the work in the same traditions and canon as a traditional research project. And so these are things that I'm like interested in and thinking about throughout the course of the project, but my initial engagement is really organizationally focused. So that's why I put the asterisks there. But the three things that I was mainly concerned with was what organizational practices contribute to stalled equity efforts. And as I got further into the project, because I had already done some work on fakequity, I began to have an inkling that there might be answers beyond the idea of fakequity. And fakequity is the idea of when you say you're going to do something, we're going to have a new DEI initiative. We're going to hire, more people of color. We're going to become more accessible and inclusive. And you have a big glossy website about it and a great PR campaign and lots of talk. and lots of flashy initiatives, and then you never actually do the work. Or as soon as the work gets hard, you stop, right? And that has explained a lot of what has happened in the United States post COVID, a grand sweeping towards DEI initiatives and a lot of lip service given to it, and then the swing back even farther away from it. The other things that I was thinking about were what organizational conditions can help staff move beyond stalled or unsuccessful equity efforts. I notice that a lot of organizations call me in after they've tried to go it once on their own and just sort of fizzled out, or it didn't exactly go the way that they planned, or they didn't get the response that they wanted, or the type of engagement that they wanted. And a lot of them just stop after that. So thinking about what organizational conditions can help them move beyond that stopping point. And then finally, what role does organizational culture play in an organization's ability to create and sustain equity-focused initiatives? I do a lot of work on organizational culture, theorizing it, engaging in projects that are involved in assessing it, and then figuring out what to do on the back end of having that knowledge. So all those things were at play. The methodology that I used, the first thing that I did was an organizational culture audit. As I mentioned before, organizational culture is a focal point of mine. And I have a process that I've developed for my company that focuses on content and rhetorical analysis of documentation first, both public facing and internal documents. Public facing includes the first 5 pages of the Google search, all of their social media engagement, anything that they disseminate publicly. And that's one bucket. The internal documents include things like employee handbooks and hiring protocols and rubrics if they have any related to that. Employee development and assessment and evaluation documentation, all of those internal things about how problems are addressed within the organization and how conflict is resolved. So I do a content and rhetorical analysis of all that documentation, and that leads me to developing a survey that gets at the organization's understanding of its own organizational culture, in addition to getting some additional information for me. And then I do self-selected one-on-one interviews with staff. So all staff are invited to sit down with me to have a brief semi-structured interview. There are 5 set questions, and then the conversation can meander because that's data in and of itself. It's not mandatory, and I always encourage organizations to explicitly say that they'll compensate people for their time, especially if they have hourly employees, to sort of incentivize people, or at least not have it be a net loss if they do sit down with me. The other pieces of information, so once I have the organizational culture audit, part of the end of it is, and here's some places where you can skill up in order to meet your stated organizational goals. So I co-create a list of trainings and develop them on my own to give to the organization. And so those trainings are also focus groups. I get to hear what sticks for them, what resonates, what's brand new information, what they think might be difficult to actually implement within the organization. I also do organizational meetings, sit in on a number of them, doing participant observation, and then have follow-up one-on-one meetings closer to the midpoint or near the end of the engagement. So my overall findings were, they have a high achievement culture. This organization says yes to everything. Somebody wants to partner, yes. There's a new grant available, yes. There is additional work that could be done to have 1 or 2 more community engagement events, yes. As a result of that, folks feel like they can never say no. And they also feel like everything is important because the work hasn't been prioritized and there's no decision tree or map as to whether or not you would say yes and why. They're not really, comparing the opportunity to what the organization is trying to do. So if it's yes to everything, then everything is important and everybody's working at a high capacity all the time, or trying to. I also noticed a lot of staff homogeneity. Yes, the traditional markers of race and ethnicity. It was a predominantly white organization, predominantly female or femme identifying organization. spots of people that don't necessarily identify in those ways, but more than just the traditional markers of identity, there was a lot of staff homogeneity in conflict management style, in lifestyle choices. There were very few parents on staff, and communication style as well. So that's sort of like a club culture. If you fit into the club, or you can adjust the ways in which you like to react and act to things, then you feel comfortable and you stay. Folks that do not conform to those norms tend to self-select out of the organization. There weren't many like horror stories about people being fired or pushed out or even purposefully discriminated against. It's more of an organizational culture thing than it is a traditional discrimination bias. Despite a flat organizational chart, there's still strong hierarchical practices throughout the organization, creative roles versus other roles. This is where the museum organizational culture was melding with the higher ed organizational culture. So curators could do whatever they wanted, no consequences, no questions asked. Anybody, and then the hierarchy went down from there on creative roles, whether or not you had a PhD, and how close to curator are you versus everybody else that's in what was considered a role to support the art. So that is all of your arts management business functions. There were set rules and behavioral norms there, of course. And then there was a lack of externalized commitments to equity. It didn't look like they were doing much from the public facing side, even though through conversations and meetings, it was clear that they had several actually stalled or failed attempts at doing it internally focused equity work, with the understanding that in order for there to be externally facing equity work, there has to be internal equity work done first. Essentially, the premise is, clean up your house before you invite guests over. So they had started to clean up, and like many of us, got everything out and then decided to watch Netflix. And so despite that, they had made multiple attempts, which is a contraindication for fakequity. There were high levels of community care. Folks talked about the difference in workload and some people feeling more burnt out than others in ways that they have tried to take care of one another. And there was full, even if it was imperfect, engagement from leadership. Normally, when you see a fakequity, organization that's engaged in fakequity, leadership is talking a game and not doing anything, or they're not even concerned about equity work. But this leadership was in every meeting, set up separate meetings, asked for additional coaching from me in order to do the things that they were actually trying to do. So these three things, when I noticed them in the data and in the organization, had me wondering, oh, they might not actually, the answer to this might not just be fakequity. Let me see what else is going on here. So that high achievement culture, the more than one attempt, and the engagement from leadership. And so what I happened upon was this idea of organizational excellence. And I've done work on the idea of artistic excellence and the problems that it creates in public arts funding. So artistic excellence was strategically deployed to gain political support during the creation of the National Endowment for the Arts in the United States. The idea was they wanted to make sure that they could signal that they would only be providing public funds to the right kind of art. A lot of the arguments against public arts funding in the United States at that time was, are we going to fund porn? Which is always everyone's concern in the United States. And so to combat that and to get more bipartisan support, it's going to be excellent art. It's only going to be artistically excellent. This was a proxy language for white, patriarchal, heteronormative, Western European-based art. And so if you could stuff all of those concepts into one small phrase that sounds relatively benign, you've done a lot of work there, and they have. They've treated this as an objective measure to limit access to public arts funding happening at the federal level, which then trickled down to the state and local levels as well. It's only in the past like 15 years or so that most local and state public art funders have actively or are working to dismantle the vestiges of artistic excellence in favor of other concepts and ways of assessing people applying for public art. This concept of organizational excellence has been sort of a related idea that is an offshoot of artistic excellence. And it originally derives from the capitalist ideal of you can do better with less, right, to increase your profit margins. And so over there in the for-profit in the United States capitalist space, it makes a little bit of sense. It's still responsible for a lot of harm, marginalization, exploitation, burnouts, psychologically unsafe workplaces, physically unsafe workplaces, but it's migrated into the nonprofit space as well. So what this means is it exacerbates pre-existing challenges and inequities in the nonprofit industrial complex, which is a large body of research that focuses on the fact that nonprofits in the United States are usually started for under the guise of some idea of public good and more community focused, but in practice just ends up replicating a lot of the harms that they say that they're trying to solve. And so this migration of organizational excellence from for-profit to nonprofit has meant that organizations are still funding practices that center Eurocentric and capitalistic ways of creating and operating, and they're doing so at the expense of the people that are actually doing the work. So nonprofit industrial complex writ large, organizational excellence more locally in this case, has contributed to a lot of burnout. Again, if they're saying yes to everything, part of the reason that they're saying yes to everything is so that they look like they're always doing more, even if they're doing more with less, to be more attractive to funders, to be to try to protect themselves from the higher ed chopping block, which presumably they're always at risk of being invited to sit down on. So this concept was really, really helpful because once I understood that this might be the case, it reframed the way that I went about the trainings and the conversations and the suggestions and advice that I gave the organization. It shifted from being focused mainly on equity work and diversity, equity, inclusion theories and concepts towards organizational structuring and organizational psychology work about prioritizing what the organization does, doing less better, and giving themselves the space to say no to things so that they have the bandwidth to do the work that they actually wanted to do, which was the equity-focused initiatives. That said, there's still some additional things that, have to be tackled, had to be tackled in this organization and in larger organizations. There are nuanced benefits to this understanding. So if you don't see explicit discrimination accompanying some implicit forms of discrimination, then the idea that organizational excellence might be the root cause can be a factor. However, it doesn't excuse internalized biases. And this is something that I experienced a lot with the executive director, who was a cisgendered woman who had come up at a time when the fields at the executive level, as many organizations, the entry and mid-level are women or femme-identified individuals, and executive level is all men, cisgendered men. And so she had navigated her way through that and thought, well, if I did it, then somebody else can do it without her needing to change the rules to make it a little bit easier for somebody like her to do it. So those internalized biases are still at play and have to be excavated and discussed and fixed, right? If there are multiple stalled equity initiatives, things like tapping out, but not like doing so because you really didn't want to do the work in the first place, organizational excellence might be the root cause of that. If the organizational inequities are not primarily or solely occurring based on protected identities. And in the United States, that concept means things that are covered by federal law, race, ethnicity, creed, gender, medical status or disability status. So those and age, those protected classes. If they're happening across socioeconomic status, depending on the context, right? Some places are just elitist and that's just how they are. But there might be some additional stuff there happening with organizational excellence, and then misalignment between buy-in and action. If you're seeing a lot of buy-in and not a lot of action, then that might be organizational excellence rather than fakeity, which is usually minimal action and minimal to no buy-in. Again, it does not excuse not doing better once you have the information. You need to have evaluation measures and procedures for everything in the organization so that you don't stumble and fall down the hill of organizational excellence. So it doesn't necessarily just have to be about measuring your equity initiatives. You also need to measure, psychological safety and health across the organization. There's also often a lack of intersectional consideration, which usually leads to implicit forms of discrimination when you don't think about the actual lived experience of a particular policy or practice or norm within an organization. And then writ large practices that perpetuate burnout are going to undermine equity efforts because that's a type of organizational change. And all of the literature says that organizational change is hard. Organizational change related to equity is extra hard. You need a little extra bandwidth to do it. And if you're burnt out, you can't do any of it at all. So in conclusion, organizational excellence, like its artistic counterpart, is a function of the nonprofit industrial complex. It definitely undermines all organizational change efforts, especially those focused on equity. The psychological contract, so the taken for granted what my employer is going to give to me and what I'm going to give to my employer, connected to organizational excellence. They are deeply entwined with longstanding problematic inequitable practices. If my contract says I work 40 hours, my psychological contract in that type of organization means that even if I'm doing 55 hours a week and it's not really sustainable, but it's really important that this work gets done, those kinds of psychological contracts lead to burnout and lead to that type of practice inequitably harming folks that may not have the additional time to spend, especially if they're not getting paid more. So all of those things I think need additional research. And then I find that organizational culture is the linchpin of overall firm success, employee engagement and well-being, and then workplace safety as well, physical and psychological safety. Additional research on identifying, assessing, and changing organizational culture is vital for understanding organizational change and adaptability, something that all organizations are particularly interested right now, and should be interested in, because even once they navigate one type of change, they're going to need to navigate another type of change sooner or later. And then I have my sources that I've cited and contact information. So I'm going to stop my share.
Thank you very much, Brea. It's now time for Jesús' presentation. We got about 20 minutes, but maybe it would be a great idea to leave like the 5 minutes in the end in order to discuss together about your insightful presentations. So yes, Jesús, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to ICOMSECA for this opportunity and for this opportunity to share our chapter, and of course to the editor, Professor Bérubé, for the invitation, because for me it's very important to speak about this new research line of Universidad de Sevilla. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jesús Heredia Carroza. I am professor in the Department of Economics and Economic History of the Universidad de Sevilla. And my research focuses on cultural economics, intellectual property rights, and the valuation of intangible heritage. In this case, we are studying also cultural participation, but in a new way for us, the inclusive cultural participation. I also work closely with cultural institutions and policymakers aiming to bridge the gap between academic research and practical cultural management. In my case, I am delegate of my municipality in Osuna. Today, I am honored to present our study titled Toward an Inclusive Cultural Participation, the Case of Chilean Museum. It is a collaborative work with Professor Reyes Martínez from the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económica in Mexico and Professor Jesús from Universidad de Sevilla. Cultural participation is a recognized human right under international law. However, despite important legislative advances, individuals with disabilities still face multiple barriers to fully accessing cultural spaces. Museums, as key institutions for cultural engagement, often remain inaccessible to many. Our study focuses on understanding how disability affects museums attendance in Chile and how broader social inequalities interplay with this relationship. To address this question, we analyzed data from 2017 National Survey of Cultural Participation in Chile, applying a logistic regression model to interpret the association. As you know, I am an economist, and we have this bias. We need data in order to apply the econometric model. In this case, the National Survey of Cultural Participation of Chile, it is a really, really good source because they divide different types of disabilities. This chapter is part of the book edited by Professor Bérubé, Marie Dio, and Professor Kuhler, Accessibility, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Cultural Sector. It's the chapter 11. The index is a typical index: introduction, literature review, methods, results, discussion, conclusion, and other important information for the research. The introduction, as I told you, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities includes the access to culture. It's a challenge, the effective participation of individuals with disabilities, in our opinion. For sure, we need to work very hard in this way in order to decrease the disabilities. It is widely assumed by researchers that individuals with disability are influenced by factors such as the family environment, the level of education, and personal empowerment. What are we studying here? Determining how disabilities are associated with the attendance of museums in Chile and what factor impact in it. How are we studying this? We use the data of the Chilean National Survey of Cultural Participation, and we apply a logistic regression. For us, it's important to share a little the result after I will speak deeply. Individuals with intellectual disabilities have diminished attendance than individuals without intellectual disability. Why? It could be for the difficulty in the understanding the artistic work and design of the museum route. Also, it's very important to speak about the financial situation has an impact in the museum's attendance. And finally, the family environment or social capital encourages cultural participation. It might suggest that museum attendance becomes more relevant. About the literature review, we have different conceptions about functional diversity. We have the medical conception, the Convention of the Right of Persons with Disabilities, and finally, the invisible disability. The medical conception, exclusively personal or individual characteristic that abstract from the social context in which the person operates. On the contrary, the social perspective is aware of the oppressive structure of the social context that is not sensitive to the real needs of people with disabilities. The second part define disability as the result of long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment that in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation and on an equal basis with others. And finally, invisible disability. An invisible disability is a condition where there are no noticeable physical signs or other signal to indicate limitations, whereas a visible disability shows outward manifestation to the casual observer. Example, physical disabilities, no? The first part here, we speak about infrastructure as a barrier or infrastructure as a facilitator. As a barrier, physical accessibility to the location, inaccessible content, insufficient seating in museums, the absence of sign language interpreters significantly, understanding the text, lack of staff training in providing access information for people with disability. As facilitator, the use of technologies is a good facilitator. Tactile exhibition, audio guides, relief structure, or information in Braille, lack of staff training in providing access information for people with disabilities. For example, now we are working in Osuna in this sense. In Spain, we have a certification, the name is Destino Turístico Inteligente, and this certification, if you want to be part of this certification, it's a national important certification, you need to have your infrastructure adapted to the people with disabilities. Now, for example, we are working for people blind people in order to create the tactile exhibition, the audio guides, and we create representations specifically for them. We need to work also for the people with mental disabilities, etc. But for the moment, we are working in the blind. But the reality is that Destino Turístico Inteligente certification is very important because if you have this certification, you can apply to special public funds. So in this moment in Spain, we are very committed with this kind of topics. Remember that this topic is about Chile because the National Survey of Cultural Participation in Chile, they have the differentiation of different types of disabilities, but in Spain, we don't have this data. For this reason, we choose the case of Chile. Educational attainment and socioeconomic level. The first one, the cost of living, all of that, we suffer the cost of living, and in the case of people with disabilities, they have, in most cases, bigger cost of living because they have special needs, no? The lack of public support. In the case of Spain, I was speaking about that, and we are very focused on the tourism. In this case, Spain tried to make together tourism, culture, heritage, etc. And for the moment, we try to create this synergy between these three parts: heritage, culture, and tourism. For this reason, we receive a lot of public funds from the tourism ministry in order to adapt these kind of things. And finally, we have the inequalities. Okay, this inequality do not affect all types of disabilities in the same way. Intellectual disability is the most exposed to exclusion. In comparison, individuals with physical disabilities have better socioeconomic prospect than those with cognitive disabilities. Here we have another variables, the social and cultural capital that authors as Bourdieu Nevo Victoria Teca work a lot about the social capital is defined as the set of resources that are linked to membership in a specific group. Also determines cultural participation, as Bourdieu proves. There is a strong relationship between socioeconomic status and social capital. The socialization, early stages of socialization with cultural setting are factors that lead to greater participation throughout life. And finally, education. Children who come from well-off and highly educated families with more cultural capital are more active in cultural participation, as Nigel explained in 2010. Now we have two research questions. What is the relationship between people with disabilities and their visits to museums in Chile? And finally, how might additional social inequalities affect this relationship? Now I am going to speak about our methodology, about the survey, the measurements, and the data analysis technique. The survey and the sampling. Data from the 2017 National Survey of Cultural Participation in Chile. Its main purpose is to characterize cultural participation practice of Chilean population over 15 years of age. It was carried out by the Ministerio de las Culturas, las Artes y el Patrimonio. Representative at the regional and national levels for urban areas and were collected using a stratified and three-stage probabilistic and complex sampling. We have more than 12,000 micro datas. It was face-to-face employing an electronic device. The measurements. The main indicator in this study is the attendance at museums variable, which indicates whether an individual attended museums during the last year or not. And now the most important part for our study. We have the disability conditions. We have different categories of these disabilities. The first one, we have the no disabilities. And after that, we have physical disability, hearing or speech impairment, intellectual disability, and finally, the visual disability. Thanks to this characterization, we have this chapter. It was very interesting, and we opened a new research line in Universidad de Sevilla, joined with Professor Bérubé, Professor Reyes Martinez. We published another paper about performing arts, and we consider these data are very well collected and very interesting for all the researchers in Chile. No? After that, we have the socioeconomic conditions, we have the indigenous identity, the sex, age, and education level, and finally, the social and cultural capital with the participation in social groups, art education, and parental cultural stimulation in childhood. So the data analysis technique, we applied a logistic regression, the statistical model by the attendance at museums as dependent variable, and the different types of disabilities. Other variable as independent variable that have been evidenced to influence in the attendance. The results. Here we have the results, the model, and we have some important conclusions about, or some descriptive important results. Only the 16.2% of people reported visiting museums and 83% did not. The 88% do not report any disability, but here the important part. 7.3 report a physical disability, 1.8 hearing or speech impairment, 0.4 intellectual disability, and 2.1 visual disabilities. Impact of disabilities on attendance. People with physical or intellectual disabilities are significantly less likely to attend museums. Physical disability, 0.45 times odd. Intellectual disability, 0.29 times odd. This suggests a strong negative effect, especially for intellectual disabilities. It's very interesting, in our opinion, those with hearing or speech impairment are more likely to attend 2.06 times odd. I think it's something that we can think that the people with the hearing or speech impairments, they can enjoy a museum without any problem. So in this case, they attend more to the disabilities than the people without any disabilities. So I think it's a very, very interesting finding, no? Socio-demographic and socioeconomic insight. Socio-demographic, being indigenous or woman, shows no significant effect. Older individuals are less likely to attend, 7.98 times odd. The socioeconomic, people in the highest socioeconomic levels are significantly more likely to attend. We have here the results, no? And level 2 and 3 shows no statistical effect, while level 1 is the baseline with the lowest participation. Education and cultural exposure. Professional education increased the attendance 1.72 times odd, and childhood art education and parental cultural stimuli also boost museum participation. All of them are demonstrated by other authors. We think our contribution is specifically the disabilities characterization, and we consider that the people with problem with the speech and hearing is our most important contribution of this chapter. No? Social participation. Those involved in social or civic groups are nearly twice as likely to attend museums, 1.99 times odd, showing the value of social connection in cultural engagement. About the discussion, we have shared barriers and opportunities as education, income, and family background. Laws aren't enough. Often the law focuses only on physical access, ignoring cognitive or communication needs. Communication is key. People with hearing or speech impairment attend museums more often, highlighting the importance of interpreters and inclusive communication. This is a problem that we need to solve in Chile, but also, for example, in Spain, in my country, we need to offer a specific formation in this case in order to prepare well interpreters and inclusive communicators. Social and cultural influences. I spoke before about the education, the income, and the belonging to community groups or associations increase cultural engagement, especially for those with disabilities. I work with a lot of associations with people with disabilities or illness, etc., etc. And it is true that they prepare a lot of cultural activities. So it's very important, the socialization, the community, and the sense of belonging of this community. So we need to work with them together in order to create these activities, the public sector and the associations. About conclusions, inequity in access to culture does not affect all people with disabilities equally, as we could observe before. No? People with intellectual disabilities are the ones at greater risk of exclusion. In both cases, there is a possibility for improvement for the first group, facilitating the interpretation of works of art or improving navigation signals would be measures that would encourage participation. And for the second, improving access facilities emerge as one of the points to consider. Now, if we want to apply for public funds in Spain, we need to work in this access facilities emerging, because you can lose a lot of points if you don't consider this improving access for people with disabilities or problem with mobility. The effective cultural participation of people with disabilities is still a challenge in our societies. It is necessary to reinforce artistic education at school. It is well known that knowledge in art is related to cultural participation. We are working about the flamenco law in Andalusia in this point. I think I am speaking more than
Thank you so much, Jesus, and thank you so much, Brea, for your insightful presentations. Well, indeed, time has run out. So, dear colleagues, unfortunately, we didn't have the time for your questions. Well, once again, I would like to thank you for participating in this session. And it was a really great honor for us to welcome you, Dr. Julie Bérubé, Dr. Brea Heidelberg and Dr. Jesús Heredia Carroza to this virtual ICOM SIGA session. And a final word, see you on our next session on May the 13th on experiencing with Laura Lott, co-author of the book Diversity, Equity, Accessibility and Inclusion in Museums, published at American Alliance of Museums in 2019. So see you very soon. Cheers and thank you so much again. Bye-bye.